I'm only going to share a little bit of it with you tonight for this course, but I wanted to share a concept that I've put together about the terminology or the vocabulary. A lot of times we hear nationally about personalized learning. You also hear the term customized put out there. You hear the term competency-based. You hear performance-based. You hear all types of terms that often people use interchangeably, and in some ways they are interchangeable. There are many commonalities with some of these pieces, but they're not at all exactly the same. And so what I want to do is give you perspective of how we define some of these terms, and give you an idea about what we call a continuum or a progression that teachers move along and institutions move along as they move from traditional to a fully customized environment. So you'll notice the graphic that I have here I put together to try to explain this concept a little bit. One of the terms you often hear is differentiation, and I've even had schools misinterpret customized learning and say, oh, we differentiate, so we're customized. Not the same thing at all. There are elements that are similar, but saying that you're differentiated does not mean that you're customized. So I want to try to explain a little bit about what those terms mean to me as we look at this. So let's start at the traditional end of the spectrum. Let's say that you're a teacher who primarily uses more of what I'm terming traditional practices in their classroom. And the first step, when they often a pretty traditional teacher wants to get to customize, what's the first thing they go after? And typically, it may be giving choice to students, giving them some activities that involve choice. So one of the easiest way to do this is maybe in a single class period, you may have set up some stations or a variety of activities where students can go and choose different things. And they all contribute to the same standard, the same skills and learning that we want students to have. But it gives them a chance to be exposed to that in a variety of ways. Often it may be that you rotate students through these activities so that they all experience it. All the students, though, when you look at this, they all start and end on that same day, whatever their activities are. These activities are often tied to that repeating schedule, like a time period when you're doing this. And often this work is still with same age type of learners. Now, once teachers get past that stage and want to move on, then what you start looking at is creating choice in providing the variety for students over a longer period of time. Let's say for a whole unit or for multiple weeks. And for our sake here, let's say a couple of weeks. So you set up a variety of activities that stretch out over multiple days. And so the idea being that you're kind of doing the same thing as the individual class period, but you're doing it over a period of time with whatever particular topic or unit that you're with. Now, still keep in mind, all the students have the same start and end time. Most of the students still have maybe some similar paths that they follow. You still probably are doing this over repeating schedule, time periods, and so on. Usually it's the same age types of learners. And that most of the progress is based on the activities. I finished this worksheet. I finished this activity. And so it's a step toward getting to a customized environment, but it's just a stage in getting there. Now, our director at TIE, Dr. Julie Mathieson, she had put together these two graphics, and when I was telling her about this progression, she said, oh, I've got something that can contribute to that. So I want to give her full credit for these two slides. But the way that we look at this is you may have a traditional unit of learning where there's you notice the black lines, the vertical black lines, start and stop. We're going to start working on this, and then there's a certain point where we're just going to stop and move on. And you may have students in a variety of places throughout this unit. You may have students who already have pre-knowledge on this, and notice those orange lines start at the left of the start point. There are students who maybe have had some exposure or maybe had some experiences in life where they know about some of these skills or concepts already. You'll notice other students that maybe their lines are further into the unit, where even with the introductory activities, this is so foreign to them, and it takes them a while to even start to figure out what is it we're talking about, what we're doing. And notice the endpoints on this. For some students, they end early because they've got it. Other students may not have gotten it yet, even when the endpoint comes about. That is what often happens in a traditional setting, in that the start and end times don't match where the students are. The goal of customized learning is really to get to this. Notice instead of single black lines on each end of the spectrum that all students have to achieve, the black lines instead are with each student. This student, their starting point may be earlier than others, and it may be their ending point is earlier than others. This student, the starting point may be later, but they figure it out really fast, and they get to the end point really fast. You may have students that have a longer stretch of time where it takes them to get this concept or this skill. But the point being is that we're trying to move away from these start and end points that are determined by teachers or facilitators, and instead we're trying to get our learners to move forward where their start and end times match where they are, as opposed to the grown-up schedule. Now, you hear the term personalized a lot, and in our definition of this, personalized isn't quite the same as customized. The way that I like to portray it is, when you look at personalized, primarily it revolves around the things that teachers can do inside an individual classroom. Personalized really comes down to, you can give students choice and you can alter pace. Those are the two primary pieces that really identify what personalized means. In our belief, personalized is a stage to get to the eventual goal we want to get to. That there are things that individual teachers can't do that have to be changed in order for you to get to that true customized environment. And even when you look at documents like the RAND report, I believe, with the Gates Foundation, and some of their definitions of personalized, it really does fall in that category of what they define as pace and choice is primarily what we're looking for, or often you hear them talk about choice and voice, where we want our learners to have some choice. But in a personalized environment, it's kind of the next stage from what I described. You're going to have a variety of activities and pathways, but instead of it being for a single unit, it's really around a start and end time that may be determined by the students. And so when a student has shown that they've mastered, it's time for them to move on. And so you still look at personalized being in that environment where it's now not just restricted to units. If this particular unit of information and skills the student works their way through and they've actually demonstrated mastery, then they move on to the next piece, ready to move forward. Whereas for other students, it may take longer for them to get there, and for other students, it may be that they have to start it later in order to get there. So it's really getting to that point that we were making. But in a personalized environment, you're still pretty well tied to repeating schedules of the buildings and the time periods. You're still often working with same-age student learners as you work through this. The next pace, though, as you get beyond that, when you start moving toward customized, is that you do have the variety of activities. There's no particular start and end time. You move on when they're mastering. But what you start to see with schools is their schedules start to flex a little. And so rather than we do reading from this time to this time every day, reading is based on what the students' needs are at that particular time. So you start to see where flexible schedules come into play. And that requires multiple teachers working on this, because the schedules are often put into place because you have to make it work for multiple teachers. And then along that same lines, you start to see where multi-age learners start to work together, where instead of it's all 9-year-olds in this room and all 10-year-olds in this room, for certain types of things, you may have an 8-year-old working with a 10-year-old. And so you start to see that flexing go on a little bit with schedules and with the ages of the learners. But if you truly get to that customized environment, it's all these things we've talked about, the variety of activities, But some of them are teacher-directed, and sometimes it may be learner-directed. No particular start and end times. We've talked about that already. No particular schedule. It's dependent on student needs. We're working in multi-age with multi-age learners working together. One of the key factors is groups flex continuously. You want them to flex continuously, so you keep balancing the challenge for learners. Often when more traditional teachers say, well, Lenny, we do that. We group our students. And the true point of that question is, how often do students change from one group to the other? And usually the response is, well, if they do well enough, they can move to a different group. But the question is, how often does that happen? And most of the time, it's not very often. That's tracking. That is not what we call flexible grouping. Also, what you start to see is facilitators, there's no way for you to, in a customized environment, to be able to do it all. You can't know all of the standards in all the content areas over multiple ages and be able to have it all by yourself. And so you start to see facilitators teaming up in larger groups where they work with a larger group of learners as opposed to, here are my kids, here are your kids. Is one of the biggest barriers to customized learning, in particular in the elementaries. But the other big one, and we see mostly at the secondary, is the whole course structure. And so what we start to see is that content isn't organized by grade levels or courses anymore, but rather on bits of learning and progressions. And then probably the most important piece in all this is that continuous feedback loop to inform the progress to mastery, that where students know exactly how well they know content and whether they're ready to actually demonstrate mastery, where they know whether they need to work on it more. Bea McGarvey, one of my favorite stories that she's told, and if you don't know Bea, she's one of the authors of Inevitable. One of her stories, she talks about one of the schools that she visited where she found that students didn't get homework assigned to them, they were self-assigning homework. Where you actually see students determining, I need to practice this, and this is probably how much I need to practice it. Whereas opposed to this teacher saying, go do 50 practice problems, the students decide, how many practice problems do I need to be ready? So the intent is they need that feedback enough to understand whether they need to be working on those pieces or not. So as a whole, when you look at this continuum, what I want to get across is that you, as facilitators in this particular course, you may be at all different places on this continuum. Some of you may be really quite a ways on the traditional end of this. Some of you may be a little bit closer to the personalized end. I can almost guarantee no one's on the right end of this curriculum yet, or this continuum yet. And so the point in this class is not that you are at this point versus this person's over here at this point. The point of this class is that I want you to move toward that customized. And if you're at the traditional end, then let's move closer to the right. If you're more in the middle, let's move farther to the right, and so on. The idea being that we all want to move ourselves forward where